Son, the fact is, if you didn't want to do loops through that bridge or fly down Market Street at second floor level, I wouldn't want you. That was General George Kinney. My name's Kevin. This week we're talking about Richard Bong, and this is History Goon. What is going on, everybody? We are back again with another episode of History Goon. This one is gonna be a hoot. It's been a minute since we did anything World War II. We've definitely never covered a pilot so far. I almost said pirate. Spoiler alert for possibly next week. Who knows? But this week we're going to talk about a man by the name of Dick Bong, which, if you're going to Google it to look this guy up, just type in Richard Bong, because unless you've got Safe Search on, you're going to get some very strange things thrown in there. Glass paraphernalia, we'll call it. Richard Ira Bong was born in Superior, Wisconsin, September 24th, 1920, to his father, Carl Bong, who is a Swedish import, and Dora Bryce, who was born in the United States. Her parents are Scotch and English. Pretty common for white folks. If you'd thrown in like German or Irish, that's about 90% of us. Dick wouldn't be an only child for very long. Mom and dad would populate the popular Wisconsin farm with a total of 9 kids, meaning he's the oldest of 9. That's a lot of kids, man. That's a lot of kids. God. But I mean, you're working on a farm. You kind of have to have that many kids at that point, I guess. So little Richard grew up out in the woods with dad, hunting and fishing. Also, obviously, farming. You have, 9 kids and you're running a farm. You're going to learn how to farm. His first brush with his career came when the 30th president, our guy out here in the state of Vermont, Calvin Coolidge, spent the summer in Superior, Wisconsin. Calvin Coolidge was born in Plymouth Notch. We're not talking about him, but he's from my neck of the woods. He's about 30 minutes from where I sit currently. He was a political rarity. He was a Vermonter that went to Massachusetts and got into politics there, whereas nowadays it's usually the other way around. We actually have more out-of-staters in political office here than we do native Vermonters, but that doesn't really matter to Dick Bong because he's just a kid. So being the president, Coolidge is obviously going to have a lot of correspondence coming and going, but since he is the president, it's not coming like regular mail. It's being flown into him. Little Dick is locked in and fascinated by the planes, and from then on, he spent a lot of his time building little model plane, like wood planes, reading books about planes, thinking about planes. And what really spurred it all on was one of these days he's out in the woods and he saw the plane go over, and it was low enough that he could read the tail numbers on it. And he looked up and just kind of like being a little kid, just waved at the pilot, not realizing that the pilot could see him, and the pilot waved back. And that was the moment that he went, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to be in the sky. So one day his father, who's a World War I veteran, told him the story about a race car driver that got recruited for World War I by the name of Eddie Rickenbacker. He's getting his own episode. I have other pilots that I have to cover before him from World War I that maybe were on the other side, maybe fought Snoopy. I don't know. He's going to get covered though. Eddie was the baddest flying American during World War I. He scored 26 kills, making him the ace of aces, meaning that he is the best fighter pilot on the American side of World War I. To be considered an ace, you have to have 5 kills, so that would make Eddie an ace 5 1/5 times over. +1. I'm not good at math. This isn't a math podcast. It's history. That's what I do. So between having his head in the clouds, he's also playing basketball, baseball, obviously hockey. He's in Wisconsin. He played clarinet in the school band. He's in the 4-H club. Farm kid, makes sense. And he's singing in the choir at his local Lutheran church. So he's a very busy kid in a small town so small that, in fact, the high school only lasted 3 years. His senior year, there were so few students that he had to commute 44 miles round trip to Superior from Poplar to go to school. And honestly, if he didn't want to be a pilot, he probably wouldn't have finished high school if he was just going to take over the family farm. But there's a thing that comes out while he's in high school called the Civilian Pilot Training Program. And this kind of came up like just towards the end of his time in high school. He graduates 18th out of 400 in his class in 1938. So he's got the idea of this civilian pilot training program that he's like, I need to do that. But the problem is, to do that, you either have to go into college or go into the military. But since the U.S. isn't at war, the standards to get in the military, not just for a pilot, but in general, are a bit higher than they normally would be. So the other thing would be, like, if you went into the military, if you just like went to a recruiting office, joined the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps, because there wasn't an Air Force at the time, he would have had to be promoted up through the ranks to become an officer before he could become a pilot. Whereas the way everything else is going to work is kind of the other way around. So thankfully, since he's already in Superior for high school, he figured, why not just go to the University of Wisconsin at Superior while I'm here? It's right there. It's down the street. I can go to college and then go fly planes. He didn't even really sign up for anything in particular for classes. He just wanted those sweet, sweet credits and paperwork saying that he served his 2 years so that he could get out and go fly. So in 1938, his first year in college, the Civil Aeronautics Act is passed, which is kind of an extension of the Civil Air program that he was trying to get into before. So the Civil Aeronautics Act, I'll get into that in a little bit further on here. The government is about to start paying college kids to become pilots. Oh, and just so happens that the University of Wisconsin at Superior was one of the first few schools that actually had access to this program. God saw Richard Ira Bong sitting in class and said, I need you in the air, my son. And that's why it's like, Wisconsin, you're in the middle of nowhere. We need pilots. So he was one of the first people to apply and get accepted. I imagine the only reason he wasn't actually first was because, he probably had to walk for like 3 days straight to get to school, unless he was living on campus, but who really knows at that point? So if you're like new to the area, the planet and all that, things are about to get really hectic for a lot of people in Europe, and then also a lot of people in Japan in the early 40s. Some critical mistakes were made. So he joined up into the Civil Pilot Training Course, which was on the surface being used to train pilots to fly, like do commercial flights and airmail and all this. But if you look just barely below the surface, it's a program that the government's working on because they see the writing on the wall that we don't want to, but we're probably going to end up getting involved in this war at some point. And judging from how the last war went, where fighting in the air was a new thing, that's not just going to go away. That's going to be something that advances, and we need more people than we had last time. Because, last time we had pilots, but they were basically flying, planes made out of balsa wood with, revolvers and dynamite that they're throwing at people. But so we're going to build real planes this time and kind of see what happens. So as soon as he joined this program, he excelled. He earned his license behind the sticks of a Piper J3, which is just a small little single prop rig that was big enough for a pilot, a co-pilot, and maybe 2 others. Think like if you've ever seen, or if you've ever, not that I have because I'm terrified of the idea of it, people that skydive. Those little small planes where they've got, the Piper, not the Piper, the pilot, co-pilot, and then, like room for like 5-6 people to sit along the walls. It's essentially the same thing. It's a very small little plane. And this is actually the most highly produced aircraft that Piper would put out. And from what I, a moron, can tell, this is the basis for most of the small single-engine planes that we have out today. like the privately owned planes that if you live anywhere near like an airport, some dude with too much money that's like, oh, I'm going to buy a plane. It's most likely something like this, where it's just a single engine little dealy. They're kind of cool, but planes scare the bejesus out of me, especially being on them, because there's not many people that are pushing 40 that can say they've never flown on an airplane. I happen to be one of them. Most of the people running this program, when they had to say anything about Dick Bong, they all kind of used the same word, and that word was natural. He ends up joining the Army Air Aviation Cadet Program in 1941, and his wing was sent to California for further training. And again, he stood out in the crowd and was sent to Luke Field, which is near Phoenix, Arizona, for gunnery training. This is the fun part, because he is a fantastic pilot. He is a terrible shot. Keep that in mind for where we're going here. So here he'd move into an AT-6, which is a single-engine training fighter. These planes had specialized governors on them to keep them from hitting top speed. Speaking of governors, his gunnery trainer was future Senator and Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater. He would actually run and lose against LBJ in 1964. Goldwater said that Bong was one of, if not the most talented pilots he had ever seen, which is saying something, because you're running a gunnery training school for pilots. So you are seeing a ton of pilots come through here. And for this guy to stand out and be the best that you've ever seen is impressive. What sucks for people like this is when you're this good at something, they tend to try to keep you there to train other people to make sure that they are just as good at it as you are. Meaning that if they can convince you to stay in a training role, you don't get to go do what you actually signed up to go do. They make you a teacher so that you can't go shoot down the Japanese. Spoiler alert, he's going to shoot down a bunch of Japanese. He also said that the amount of time Bong spent hunting small animals made him like an absolutely lethal shot in the air. If you read into anything that Dick said about himself about shooting, is like I was not a good shot. And that's the thing, is a lot of these like dogfights he's going to get into, he's not shooting somebody from 1,000 yards away, just like lighting them up. He's making sure he's right on top of them, because he knows that he's not a good shot. One day, Dick squares off with a Czechoslovakian pilot over Luke Field. Dick in his AT-6 and the Czech in a P-38 Lightning. And the P-38 Lightning was fantastic. It was designed and developed by Lockheed and introduced to service in July of 1941. It's a dual prop, twin boom aircraft, meaning that it's dual prop meaning has two engines. Twin boom means that it has two separate tail fins that connect it, that come back on the sides and then connect to a larger piece in the back to stabilize it. Lockheed would also bring us such fantastic products as like the SR-71, which is one of the scariest planes that's ever existed. This thing can fly like at orbit and take pictures of a mosquito's nuts on the surface of the earth. So the P-38 would go on to be one of the most successful American aircrafts at the beginning stages of the war. Neat little fun fact that I learned in my research, because I have dabbled with planes and stuff like that with video games and movies and all that. I didn't realize that the first letter in the plane's name like that is a designator for its class. So if you have one starting with F, that makes it a fighter. If you have one starting with B, that makes it a bomber. P is for pursuit. So the P-38 Lightning, which is classified as a pursuit craft, isn't really a pursuit craft because it doesn't qualify to be a pursuit craft going off of the parameters of a pursuit craft. So this part's a little weird. It's so much different than anything else that they've ever hung the pursuit thing on, that that's really the only place they could stick it, because like this plane had no right to be as good at everything as it was. So it's basically its own thing. The original design said that it could fly at over 360 miles an hour. Turns out with the dual engines, it would end up clocking in at closer to 415 miles an hour, which is about 100 miles an hour faster than any other fighter on the planet at the time. It has 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20 millimeter cannon. It can also climb to over 20,000 feet in elevation in under 6 minutes, which is pretty impressive for an aircraft at the time. But it did that while also carrying 1,000 pounds of ordnance, plus anything for the machine guns. So you have 1,000 pounds of bombs, 4 50 caliber machine guns, and a 20 millimeter cannon. The 20 millimeter rounds are 3/4 of an inch in diameter, which that's a big chunk of whatever to be firing at somebody or something. And keep in mind, it was somebody, because these planes that you're shooting at aren't remote controlled. They're controlled by another human. And those 20 millimeter rounds don't really care what is around the person if that's what it's going to hit. It's going to turn the inside of that cockpit into chunky beef stew. Not optimal for the pilot. So where this thing stood out is fighter and pursuit planes usually carried 500 pounds of bombs. So the committee that oversaw the creation of it came up with a new category for the P-38, which is the category of interceptors. So the Pursuit 38 Lightning is actually an interceptor, but we never reclassified it because that would have taken too much time to change the P to an I. You know, the P-38 is basically the scariest thing on wings until the P-51 Mustang arrives on the scene, in my opinion. I think the Mustang was one of the better fighter planes of World War II. The Mustangs and the Hellcats are pretty excellent. I guess we'll give the British their due. They had some really cool ones too, like the Spitfire, and you got to give them credit somewhere, I guess. The Germans, though, German airplanes were ridiculous. There was actually a World War II pilot from Germany that I think, I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure they claim that he shot down over 400 aircraft. But he was fighting Russians, so he probably could have shot those down with like strong language, because they were made of paper mache and bubble gum. Except for the Night Witches. We'll get into them at some point too. All female Russian bomber squadron. Anyway. So a couple other notable pilots that slapped the Japanese around with the P-38s. Charles H. McDonald, who had 27 aerial victories, making him an ace 5 times +2 over. Anyway, back to our training flight in Arizona with our Czechoslovakian pilot here. Bong should have been at a disadvantage. He's in an aircraft designed to be slow and not really all that great. It's definitely not as good as the Lightning. Not nearly as fast, not as maneuverable, not a great plane. The Czech pilot also has well over 100 flight hours more than Bong, but after not being able to shake him or avoid falling into a kill spot, the two landed, the Czech shook his hand, and named Dick Bong the better pilot. That's pretty impressive. I mean, to be like, yeah, I'm good, but this dude is like, he was on my ass and I could not get away from him. Pretty good. This personal victory for Dick Bong would be very short-lived, though, because December 7th, 1941, the Japanese made what I would refer to as a tactical error when they bombed Pearl Harbor. Historically, touching our boats has not been a good thing for anyone. That's how we started our first foreign war, was after the Revolutionary War. We had a bunch of our boats got attacked by pirates over off the coast of North Africa, and we sent dudes over there to tell them that we don't like having our boats touched. It's kind of where like those fights were where the Marines earned the nicknames Jarheads and Leathernecks because of the hats and the collars that they wore. It's where the Marine Corps sword came from, because their general was like, you're pretty cool, and he gave Commodore a saber, and ever since then they've just been kind of like, they tweaked it and like, it's ours now, and don't touch our boats. It's a public service announcement to anybody that may consider it, be you Houthis or Chinese or Russians or whomever. as a history enthusiast and an American, don't touch our boats. It will not end well. So while they were bombing Pearl Harbor, they probably should have diverted someone away from the USS Arizona and towards like the state of Arizona to try to kill Dick Bong specifically. That's another mistake the Japanese would come to greatly regret, because Dick Bong is about to make it rain Mitsubishis. He dove headfirst back into his training and graduated at the top of his class. He's just trying to make a point here. After proving that he was possibly the baddest man in the sky, the Army decides to put that to good use by keeping him out of combat at Luke Field as a gunnery instructor. So now Second Lieutenant Bong is training other men to go do what he is destined to do. But in 1942, he's sent to Hamilton Field in San Francisco, where he would train for the first time on the P-38 Lightning. After learning about the problems with this aircraft, like the fact that the cooling system had a tendency to freeze up at higher altitudes when they tried to use them in Europe, most of the guys kind of put two and two together and figured that, like, if we're getting trained up on this plane that they're not using in Europe because it's too cold, we're probably going to go somewhere where it's a touch warmer and use them because they won't freeze up over, I don't know, the South Pacific. Richard Bong quickly fell into the attention of Major General George Kenney, the commander of the 4th Air Force, and the provider of our opening quote, which we'll get to here in a little bit. Kenney referred to him as, quote, a gifted pilot and an incorrigible hot dog. This is because Dick gets into a little bit of trouble here and there, doing some stunts. He would take his flight wing out on training, and while everyone else is in formation, he would drop down and during this one particular instance, they're in formation, and he drops down and buzzes downtown San Francisco just because he can. Since you don't make Major General by being a fun-loving dude, Kenney posted an order on the hangar saying that things like this will not be tolerated ever again. And since Dick Bong is a well-adjusted adult gentleman, he follows the rules to a T, and he definitely didn't fly right back down Market Street waving at people at about 30 feet off the ground and blowing laundry off of some poor lady's dryer lines, and then flying directly at the Golden Gate Bridge and doing loop-de-loops through the spans. So think about where we're at here, right? This is 1942. It's like June 1942. So the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor 6 months before this. San Francisco would be a great target for the Japanese to hit if they're trying to hit like mainland America to cause chaos and kill civilians. San Francisco would be a great spot for them to go. And this dude is flying directly at like one of the busiest bridges in the country, and then just doing loop-de-loops around it because it's fun. I swear to God, I did not make any of that up. I couldn't have. The woman that lost her laundry actually filed a complaint directly with Major General Kenney. And as annoyed as Kenney was about this, he took it with a big grain of salt. He'd been around long enough to know that most of the guys that went to fight in planes have some level of mental instability because you kind of have to be a fighter pilot. And doing stuff like this that kind of proves that Bong is probably wily enough to not get shot down in combat. He did, however, once he spoke to this woman, and obviously the plane was low enough that she got the tail number off of the plane. So he goes to his Rolodex and he's like, oh yeah, that's Dick. Great. Everybody lands. He goes and finds him and he's like, listen, you ever do that again and I will personally kill you. But first of all, you're going to go back and you're going to redo that lady's laundry and you're going to hang it up and dry it. So he went and did her laundry and rehung it. One day, not too far after that, Dick is called to Kenney's office, and he's probably thinking, like, worst case scenario, he's walking through the door, he's standing in front of the man, all 5'8" of himself, he's pooping paving stones, thinking that he's about to lose his wings and probably get kicked out of the Army. It turns out Kenney had been tasked with setting up the 5th Air Force, which would be based out of Australia. He was supposed to personally handpick some pilots, and Dick Bong just so happened to be the first one on the list for guys that he wants on the ground in the air. whichever. So when explaining why he wanted Dick to be part of this so badly, he said, quote, "Son, the fact is, if you didn't do those loops for that bridge or fly down Market Street at second floor level, I wouldn't have wanted you." So he's got a lot of respect for him because he is crazy, and he's also a very, very good pilot. And he arrived in Australia in September and sat around for a month or so before his plane finally arrived. But since he wasn't really getting paid to sit on his ass and do nothing, Kenny had him temporarily assigned to the 35th Fighter Group in Fort Moresby, New Guinea. This is not a vacation. New Guinea was a pretty rough island to try to take. It's lousy with Japanese infantry and aircraft. They've got a couple of small runways there where they're launching aircraft. Personal story. I never met my grandfather, unfortunately. I did, however, hear some stories about him from my grandmother. He was in the Army during World War II, but he was attached to the Marine Corps as a transportation driver. He drove Higgins boats, which are like the landing craft that were going up onto the beach. And he was actually one of the craft that landed on New Guinea in one of the early waves that went through. And he told her that he was getting shot at so much, like there were so many bullets coming through the windshield at him that he couldn't even reach up behind him to grab his rifle to get it down if he ever needed it. And he landed this craft from the floor of his boat. So you'd have to come up to the beachhead, turn and back in so you can drop the gate to let everybody out. He had to do that basically sitting on the floor because he was being shot at so much that he couldn't put his head up to see where he was, or else he would have been killed. There's also stories about after the landing where it had been a couple of days, they went to go move the craft, and there was a giant whatever kind of snake in his, and he refused to move it, and somebody came over and shot it and dragged it out, and he goes, "Okay, good, now I'll move the boat." Kind of wish I'd met him. That would have been cool to get some of his stories, but I don't really know if it's at this point or a few weeks later. Not real important. What is important is at some point in this general time frame, there's an advisor going from airbase to airbase talking to the pilots. He's kind of like giving them advice about if you get into a dogfight, you should try this. These are the different maneuvers you can try. Very, very experienced. Dick hears that this guy is on his base and he doesn't want to miss the opportunity to learn something new. He shows up. He gets to sit down to meet Eddie Rickenbacker, the U.S. ace of aces, his childhood hero. And after everybody else leaves, he kind of peels off with Eddie, and they just kind of sit and talk for like a couple of hours. Just talking planes, talking combat, all this. And they get on the topic of how Eddie broke the record. He explained that during World War I, it was really easy to tell if you scored a kill because you're fighting over land. And pilots don't have parachutes during World War I for the most part. They were very, very rare to have one. So basically, if you got shot down, you died because you're not hitting the water, which I mean, hitting the water at a great rate of speed is not really much of a consolation prize, I guess, but the ground is a hell of a lot harder than the water. He said it was actually fairly easy to confirm kills because, again, you're fighting over land, and you could just fly back a little bit later and see the wreckage. Doesn't matter if the pilot's dead. If the plane's dead, that counts as a kill. Rickenbacker said that it would be really tough for someone to break the record. He's not bragging because he's not really that kind of guy. He's saying that because you're fighting over the ocean. You're going to be fighting more over the ocean than you are over land. And he also said that he didn't think pilots would have as much of an opportunity to do a lot of fighting against the Japanese, which he could not have been more wrong about anything than he was about that. And Dick kind of like chuckled at this, and he said, I heard we're going to have plenty of Japanese planes to shoot down. And Eddie apparently kind of laughed at this, and he kind of heard it in Dick's voice that he was challenging him a little bit. And Eddie said to him, quote, "If you shoot down more Japanese than I did Germans, I'll buy you a case of scotch." General Kenny, who just so happened to be right in that area, was listening to this conversation or walking through it or whatever, doubled down and said, yeah, I'll throw one in too if you shoot down more than him. And it gets back from General Kenny up to his superior, which is 5-star General Hap Arnold, who got in on the action and said, hey, if you shoot down more than him, they'll give you the scotch. I'll throw in a case of champagne. And then the general commander of the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur, who I do not like him. I'll get there eventually. Real scumbag. Anyway, here's about the whole thing. It says, I'll throw in 2 cases of champagne on top of that. What's going to be happening in the air is all part of MacArthur's grand island hopping scheme. Infantry are fighting from harbor to harbor, basically, and green new pilots would go up with more experienced guys, but kind of stay off to the side and, kind of back up the fighting just to get a little taste of what's going on. Dick is assigned to be the wingman of Captain Tom Lynch, where he would spend almost a month flying with him, doing like long recon flights, bomber escort missions. And that kind of would change December 27th of 1942. 1 year and 20 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Dick Bong gets his first real taste of combat. Captain Lynch was leading the 12-plane squadron made up of P-38s, and they intercepted 40 Japanese craft over the northwest coast of New Guinea. The American pilots, not having much of a choice, did the only smart thing they could do, and they flew directly into the teeth of the Japanese. Obviously, we weren't there. We can't say for sure if Dick was scared about this whole thing. I could imagine being excited to see some air-to-air combat and, but to immediately be thrown into the hornet's nest, maybe a little bit different. Pretty early on in this dogfight, Bong killed a Japanese fighter and a bomber, like within minutes of each other. All in all, the Americans won this little skirmish. They shot down a dozen Japanese crafts. And for his part, Dick would be awarded the Silver Star, and he also got to put the first of many rising sun tattoos on the hull of his P-38. Now, before I go too far, I want to go back and talk about Captain Lynch here. At the time, he had, I think he had like 22 kills, which meant that at the time of this fight, he would have been the pilot, the American pilot in the Pacific that had the most kills of anybody. And eventually he's going to get sent back home to sell war bonds because you can't, it's just a whole big thing. We'll get into that here though. By mid-January, he would score his 5th kill, making him an ace. And this happened over Leh Harbor. Then in February, he was shipped to the 9th. And on March 3rd, 1943, he was flying a bomber escort mission over the Bismarck Sea, protecting B-25s and B-17s. He killed a Zero and chased off a few more as the bombers did their thing, which, when I say did their thing, they downed 4 Japanese destroyers and 8 transport ships, which is a pretty damn good day at the sticks, I would say. After this run, Major General Kenny promoted him to first lieutenant and gave the double ace a 2-week leave in Australia. Dick Bong is not really an R&R kind of guy, so he spends the 14 days there. He's just chomping at the bit. He wants to get back, and he wants to shoot down more bad guys. Most of the people that knew him said that he was basically 2 different people. On the ground, he's kind of a shy dude, kept to himself, very reserved. He's not like running around with the boys, drinking and doing anything wild like that. In the air, he's a demon. Some of the other members of his fighter squadron said that it seemed like he took more joy trying to outfly and outposition the enemy than he did actually shooting them down. So I get that. He himself would even say that he was a better pilot than a better shot, but he really wanted to show them this whole idea of, I'm about to introduce you to the Little Mermaid cinematic universe, but before you die, you are going to know that I'm a better pilot than you. His big day came July 26, 1942, on a bombing run over Leh. He killed 4 enemy fighters, which is 1 shy of making him he killed 4 enemy fighters, one more time. He killed 4 enemy fighters, which is one shy of making him a one-day ace, which is pretty impressive. General Kenny, as a matter of fact, was so impressed by this, he starts filing some paperwork. One folder was for a promotion to captain, and the other folder that he starts filling out would end up with Dick being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is a big deal. Word gets back to the States about how fantastic this guy is, and all the papers are starting to recount like his action in combat. And here's the first kind of like rumblings that he is going to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker, and he is going to become the ace of aces. Around here, one of his wingmen asked to speak to General Kenny privately. So General Kenny doesn't really know what's going on with this conversation. And this guy told him that Dick was, quote, giving away Japanese. And Kenny's kind of like, what are you talking about giving away Japanese? What does that even mean? So he goes on to tell him that Dick is up there shooting these Japanese planes a ton, and then just backing off and calling in one of his wingmen to come in and finish him off. So then when they would get back to the ground, Dick would congratulate his wingman and say, hey, that was a really good job. I saw you shoot down that enemy plane, and I can confirm the kill. We can put that on your list. Because he wanted to spread the love. He didn't want to have all the fun himself. Plus, he had kind of seen what had happened with Tom Lynch, where after so many kills, they shipped him home to protect him. And this was a really big thing during World War II. If you had someone become a war hero for doing something insane, like shooting down 1 million enemy planes, or pulling an Audie Murphy and grabbing a machine gun on top of a burning tank and killing 1,000 Germans just because they were there so your guys can get back to safety, they would tend to send that fellow home to sell war bonds because he's a celebrity and he'll sell bonds like crazy. And a lot of these guys that got sent home to sell war bonds hated it because they were being taken off of the front line. They were being taken away from their guys, and they would feel bad if anybody died when they weren't there because they would feel like they could have been there to protect them. Kind of how it is. And then if you have someone that's made a name for themselves doing heroic things and he dies in the war, that is a kick straight in the morale sack. General Kenny did the math with this whole thing, and he figured that Dick was giving away basically a kill for every 2 that he scored. And he didn't have to do that. He could have just been like, I'm killing every single one of these guys. You guys just, you may as well land because I'm going to do it myself. Sometime in November of 1943, he scores kills number 20 and 21 when he shot down a pair of Zeros over the Reval airfield. And I've mentioned him shooting down Zeros like it's really no big deal, when in fact the Mitsubishi Zero was one of the best aircraft during World War II. That includes American aircraft, German aircraft, British aircraft, Russian aircraft, and the Japanese. The Zero was fantastic. And it wasn't necessarily the speed that made the Zero effective. It's the maneuverability and the range. It could actually stay in the air for about 3 times longer than most other aircraft of the time. And another thing that you really have to give them credit for is the skill of the Japanese pilots. Japanese airmen from World War II didn't really get the credit they kind of deserve. Yeah, I mean, some of them went through training specifically for kamikaze missions. But other than that, there were a lot of very, very skilled, very disciplined young men in the air over the South Pacific fighting for the Japanese. So credit where it's due. Yeah, they were on the wrong side of it. Whatever. They were still pretty damn good. I mean, the same can be said for German pilots or German tankers. Yeah, they were the bad guys. I get, if you want to, if that's the way you want to look at it, or if it's just, they were opposition to us. They were still really, really good at what they were doing. And that's you have to separate with the Germans. You have to separate the Wehrmacht and the SS, because like the regular German army that weren't involved with the awful things that the Germans were doing were just regular kids. They were just like, would have been like your grandpa that got drafted to go fight. It was the same thing. The ones that were doing evil stuff had to like volunteer to do it and prove that they were qualified to do it through whatever genetics and all that stuff they were doing. So from here, General Kenny saw that Bong could be just as useful stateside selling war bonds, so he sent him home on leave for 60 days. And while he was home, he was named honorary homecoming king at his alma mater, where he would meet a girl by the name of Marjorie Vattendale, the homecoming queen. By the time his 2 months ran up, he's going back to war with pictures of his gal that he's going to stick in the cockpit glass. So 2 months later, he gets back to the Pacific, and he has his little...
Oh, boys! I'm back!
And when he gets back, he realizes that nobody is even close to catching him on the kill count. After some cosmetic upgrades to his plane, being a painting of Marge on the nose of his plane, and then he also had Marge stenciled under the cockpit window in cursive. Really excellent, because it's like everybody did like the pinup girls. This was just like a really nice, tasteful picture of his girl, like right on the front of his plane, and he's like, "Yeah, that's my lady." So with all that being done, he's ready to get back in the air. Since he was, again, the baddest man on the planet in the air, he didn't have to really follow the rules that others did. Most of the pilots are assigned to areas, so you may see bad guys, you may not, because you're playing zone. He's given free rein to go where he wanted to chase bad guys to try to break this record. This is getting a little tricky, though, because the Japanese are sending less and less planes out, because as the war is going on, they start taking up a more defensive mindset. On February 15th, as a late Valentine's gift, he and Marge got their first kill together as a couple, and it would turn out to be his only one for the month, other than shooting up some planes and transports on the ground, but those don't really count for your record, I guess, because you're really not killing an enemy aircraft because it's already on the ground, so you're just incapacitating it and making sure they can't fly it. The silver lining to the transport kill is it was loaded to the edge of the hibachi tables, which helped to kind of throw a wrench in the works for the Japanese war effort. They're flying a mission over Ate Harbor in New Guinea when Lynch was shot down in front of him. Watching his mentor die obviously has a negative effect on him. He didn't score another kill until April 3rd when he splashed his 25th enemy. Now Dick is starting to get his groove back. He decides that April 12th, he was going to cut loose and put his name in the books when he shot down 3 enemy planes in quick succession. Instead of being like a salty old man when he got word that his record had been broken, Rickenbacker sent him a telegram congratulating him and informing him that his case of scotch would soon follow. Not to be outdone, General Kenny told him that he'd be sending a case of champagne, and people back home got a little annoyed that a pilot is being sent booze while in combat, because this is kind of like right, not too far after Prohibition has ended, so alcohol is still kind of frowned on, and the fact that we're sending booze to a young man that's flying and fighting for his country and he's being a hero, people didn't like that. So with all the word getting out and people getting upset, the bet was changed to Coca-Cola. General Hap Arnold, who had met Bong personally when he was on leave, instead of sending the champagne, he sends Dick 2 cases of Coca-Cola. And this is the good stuff, like glass bottles, real sugar, none of the corn syrup. This is good Coca-Cola. And it would actually turn out to be Dick's favorite drink. And who can blame a guy? I'm a Coke guy myself, but he was getting the good stuff. Now, Dick didn't know that breaking the record would be a bad thing for him in the long run. He's now a national treasure, and the Army would do everything they could to keep him from going and getting into fights. This meant that they're keeping him from going up on missions and eventually sending him stateside for 5 months to do publicity tours and sell war bonds, which I couldn't imagine he enjoyed a second of that, other than maybe going home and seeing Marge. Speaking of, the big thing was, he was back home for 5 months selling bonds. He proposed to Marge, his girl, not the plane. And He returned to the command of General Kenny in 1944 as a full-blown gunnery instructor and was told, quote, "You are only allowed to fire in self-defense on missions." Between October and November, he had 8 self-defense kills. General Kenny was so annoyed about this that he sent a letter to overall commander of the Pacific Theater, Douglas MacArthur, saying something like, I'll show him, basically, and recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Because he knew if Dick received the Medal of Honor, he's no longer allowed to fight. You get the Medal of Honor, you go home, you sell war bonds, you're miserable, you get to do whatever you want, but you get to fly for free when you go anywhere in the country. MacArthur agrees to this and sends the request up the flagpole. December 8th, 1944, he was in Tacloban City, Philippines, when he stood in front of a small gathering and had this read, quote, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty in the Southwest Pacific area from October 10th to November 15th, 1944, though assigned to duty as gunnery instructor and neither required nor expected to perform combat duty, Major Bong voluntarily and at his own urgent request engaged in repeated combat missions, including unusually hazardous sorties over Balikpapan, Borneo, and in the Leyte area of the Philippines. Leyte was a meat grinder in the Philippines. His aggressiveness and daring resulted in his shooting down 8 enemy airplanes during this period. So, yeah, they gave him the Medal of Honor. Then as a little treat to himself, call it an early Christmas present, in December, he shot down 4 more planes. This brought him up to the level of an octuplet ace. He has 40 air-to-air kills. After this, he shipped back home, where he arrived on New Year's Eve. From there, he went to D.C. and was sent to work with Hap Arnold, doing press conferences, public appearances. That is up until February, when he sneaks back to Wisconsin to marry Marge in his childhood Lutheran church, which is fantastic. After the wedding and honeymoon, he's assigned to test out the new P-80 Shooting Star. This is the first American-made jet aircraft. Now, it's not the first jet aircraft in general. It's just the first American jet aircraft, because the Germans had done the... I can't remember if it was a Messerschmitt or a Fokker-Wulf, but one of them they made with a jet engine. It never really saw a lot of combat, though. So he's got a lot to learn with this new system and new craft, but he is definitely the guy for the job. August 6th, 1945, he's scheduled to make his 12th test flight. He gets up to speed and lifts the nose off the runway and into the sky when the engine caught fire and died. The plane goes nose first into the ground, and Dick Bong is killed instantly on impact. Now, I'm sure somewhere some Japanese general got a telegram about this, stepped out of his office, wiped his brow, maybe lit a cigarette to be like, thankfully this guy's going to leave us alone finally, just in time to see the sun rise for the second time that day in Hiroshima as the Enola Gay peeled off after releasing the atomic bomb on the city. He died the same day that Little Boy became the first ever instant rice cooker. His death was completely overshadowed by the bombing, obviously, because one man's death versus, I don't know, dropping a atomic bomb on a city. Which one's going to make headlines more, you know? The only place that it really made headlines bigger than the atomic bomb was in Poplar, Wisconsin, where a small town mourned for the death of a hero. This may be the saddest part of the story. Richard Ira Bong was 24 years old when he was killed, which, that's insane to think that he did all of that in just a handful of years and wasn't, and by today's standards, wouldn't be old enough to rent a car when he was killed piloting an experimental aircraft. Absolutely insane. There's a lot of people that say that if he had not died, there is absolutely zero question that when the time came for the space program, he would have absolutely been involved with that. He would have been one of the early on pilots, astronauts, whatever they were. he would have definitely been a part of that program. There's no question about it. So I've got to include a couple of quotes here from some people that had more respect for Dick Bong than can be measured by any metric. Quote, Major Richard Bong was an example of the tragic and terrible price we must pay to maintain principles of human rights of greater value than life itself. This gallant Air Force hero will be remembered because he made his final contribution to aviation in the dangerous role of test pilot of an untried experimental plane, a deed that placed him among the stout-hearted pioneers who gave their lives in the conquest of sky and space. That was Eddie Rickenbacker, who had become really good friends with him. They had a lot of respect for each other. And obviously, like, Dick grew up with this guy as his hero. Like, he wanted to be Eddie when he grew up. And sometimes you get to outdo your heroes, and, you know, it was pretty cool. Here's another one. Quote, You see, we not only loved him, we boasted about him. We were proud of him. That's why each of us got a lump in our throat when we read the telegram about his death. Major Bong, ace of American aces in all of our wars, is destined, again, one more time, is destined to hold that title for all time. With the weapons we possess today, no war of the future will last long enough for any pilot to run up 40 victories again. That was General George Kenney. And he was absolutely right, because to this day, Dick Bong still holds the record for the most air-to-air kills. So it's kind of a bummer, right? Not the best way to end a story like this. And that's why I absolutely refuse to leave here on a bad note. He deserves to have his episode end on something way more fun than that. One of his first missions as a squadron leader over in New Guinea, a member of his squad is having some engine problems. The engine, I believe the technical term for it went kerflooey. So we have a couple options here. We can either try to land at the airbase with one engine, which is really bad because with one engine trying to land, you're not going to have good control over the plane. You could kill somebody on the ground. You could damage more aircraft, which that's not good for the war effort at all. And if you crash it, the chances of you getting another plane, not just a P-38, but another plane in general, are very, very small. You're more than likely going to end up hanging out on an airbase and just doing whatever because we can't get you a plane because you crashed one. So at this point, they decide the best course of action is for this pilot to bail out somewhere and to let the plane go. You know, cut your losses, don't die. So you bail, we'll come back and get you ASAP. Dick called back to base to get a recon plane in the air before this guy even ejected from the plane. So the recon plane is in the air. They spot the pilot. Dick lands, refuels, and gets back in the air to go provide security at the lake that this dude landed in because, believe it or not, if the Japanese found a downed pilot, they would have absolutely killed him. Like, God forbid they had seen him eject from the plane because they would have strafed him midair, which is a no-no. But the Japanese were not really known for not committing war crimes during World War II. There's an episode in the works that is going to be very, very hard to listen to about Japanese war crimes, but I digress. Anyway, Dick's at a very high altitude to kind of keep an eye out for enemy aircraft, but he's not high enough up that he can't see the pilot who's now made his way to the beach. He can tell that the guy's banged up. He's not sure if he's got a broken leg or if he hurt his back or something because he's not moving quite right. So he makes it to the beach. Cool. He sees the rescue team rowing a raft across the lake to go pick him up because it's easier than trying to fight your way through the jungles that are the jungles on New Guinea that are so thick you could probably barely see 5 feet in front of you. Cool. He then sees a big log floating near the raft, and he doesn't really think anything of it. He radios over to the recon plane, and he's like, hey, I'm still up here. If you need anything, just let me know. The recon pilot comes back like, yeah, actually, if you wouldn't mind killing the giant goddamn crocodile that is swimming towards the raft, that would be excellent. So he kind of circles around a couple of times, and he's like, oh, yeah, that is a crocodile. That's not a log. So he dives and strafes this crocodile. I remember at the beginning when I was talking about the armament on this plane, where it's got the 450 caliber machine guns, a 20 millimeter cannon. Great. What's a little weird is that somebody in the R&D team decided that they only need one trigger, and it's going to fire all of the guns at the same time. So he flies down, he makes reptile mist, checks on the rescue team, finds everybody's good, nobody got hurt, crocodile's dead, pilot's good. He takes back off and lands back at the airfield. Newspapers back home heard about this and started writing headlines like "Lightning Strikes Crocodile." And some of the guys in his squadron started teasing him, asking him like, "Yeah, so you got a couple of rising sun flags painted on your plane. You gonna put a crocodile on there too next to him?" Would have been so good if he did, but he did not, unfortunately. So another thing I want to do here is I want to kind of speed through some of the things that were dedicated to the memory of Richard Bong. You have Richard Bong State Recreation Area on the site of what was to be Bong Air Force Base in Kenosha County, Wisconsin. You have the Richard I. Bong Memorial Bridge along U.S. Route 2 in the twin ports of Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin. The Richard I. Bong Airport in Superior, Wisconsin. Bong Barracks on the Aviation Challenge Program. I'm sorry, one more time. Bong Barracks of the Aviation Challenge Program. Major Richard I. Bong Bridge on MacArthur Drive, Annandale, Townsville, Australia. And I have the coordinates if anybody's curious about that. Major Richard Ira Bong Squadron of the Arnold Air Society at the University of Wisconsin. The Richard Bong Theater in Misawa, Japan. That was probably a painful one for them to name. And the 613th Air and Space Operations Center, 13th Air Force, Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. Bong Avenues on the former site of the decommissioned Richards Gabor Air Force Base on Laughlin Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. On Luke Air Force Base in Glendale, Arizona. On Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage, Alaska. Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, Washington. And Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, Japan. Bong Boulevard on Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City, Louisiana. Bong Terrace, Mount Holly Township, New Jersey. The Mountain View neighborhood, which was built between 1956 and 1957. Bong Street, Dayton, Ohio, leading to the National Museum of the United States Air Force and on Holloman Air Force Base near Alamogordo, New Mexico. That would actually, oh man, that National Museum of the U.S. Air Force would be really cool to go to. But after talking mess like I did about Ohio last week, I'm not sure they'll let me back in. The National Aviation Hall of Fame, he was inducted into that in 1986. The Wisconsin Aviation Hall of Fame, that was in 1987. Bong was named as the class exemplar at the United States Air Force Academy for the class of 2003. The International Air and Space Hall of Fame, he was inducted there in 2018. The Richard I. Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin, is housed in a structure intended to resemble an aircraft hangar and contains a museum, a film screening room, and a P-38 Lightning restored to resemble Bong's plane Marge. So, that was Dick Bong. God, what a life. I mean, way too short, but at the same time, he did so much in that short period of time that, I mean, I don't know that he would have been disappointed to know that he was only going to get 24 years and know that he was going to do all of that in it. But anyway, with that being said, I would love it if you went over to Patreon, patreon.com/1159media. And for $5 a month, just $5 a month, that's like a medium Dunkin' Donuts coffee. Just skip one. It's fine. You can do it. Get coffee at work. Get gas station coffee. It's just as good, if not better. But for $5 a month, you get early access to History Goon. You get early access and backdoor access to Guestnicity, Never Daily, 911, 911 calls with the operator. They all do like backdoor access where you can kind of like go and watch them live. You guys really don't want to do that with me because then you're just going to hear me swear a bunch that I have to cut out. You also get access to Almost Fiction with Chase, which is fantastic. I'm trying to start from the beginning, but I just have to buckle down and actually have time to listen to stuff while I'm at work. But yeah, we've got all of that. Or if you want to support me directly, I do have a Ko-Fi, which is ko-fi.com/historygoonpod. You can make a donation there. It goes directly to me. I mean, either way, that's if you want to make a donation to me, that's awesome. It's greatly appreciated. I'm not going to beg you for money. I don't like doing that. But the Patreon is worth $5 a month. It really is. You get so much stuff. And then if you could rate, review, and subscribe wherever you can. Yeah, I mean, the big ones, obviously, Apple, Spotify, whatever. You can also go over to the Facebook page, History Goon Podcast on Facebook. There's a bunch of weirdos there. You'll love it. It's a lot of fun. If you want to just see all kinds of stupid history memes that me and everybody there are posting. If you like the show, you'll like the page. Let's put it that way. It's fun. Have an Instagram, History Goon Pod. Not quite as active as the Facebook, but that's because it's Instagram and it's not as interactive as Facebook, obviously. But yeah, with all that being said, we're all going to die someday. So go out and do some goon shit and leave a mark in the world, just like Dick Bong. Thanks.